Hello, and welcome back to Parley. This one was requested by PistilWhip. I hope you'll enjoy listening. PistilWhip says, lyrical analysis of Mili's Paper Bouquet. It's a song. Cassie Wei is the lead vocalist and lyricist for the Japanese artist Mili. Her work has been featured in the previous parlays regarding Limbus Company, and she has a number of songs in the preceding game, Library of Aruna. For my March parlay, I'd like to draw Captain's attention to the anime opening for The Executioner and Her Way of Life. I've seen a little bit of that. While the lyrics are not necessarily sung, from the perspective of the eponymous executioner, a short synopsis of the series may provide useful context. Briefly, the fantasy world of Executioner bears the scars of lost ones, in essence, isekai immigrants from Japan, but Japanese people who got sent to this other world. The focus character is a member of a sect that suppresses knowledge of summoning lost ones and assassinates any that slip through the cracks. With that foundation established, I would like to draw your attention to the second verse of the song, with emphasis on 3 lines in particular. So I'll say emphasis where PistilWhip has emphasized. Faster than the speed of light, shining bright, falling into our eyes. Emphasis, we are sapphires laying on sand. The world now tastes a bit saltier. End emphasis. Forward, marching forward. Looking back, my path traces out a red line. Is the future set in place? Is it not too late? Too late to be a good girl today? I have just enough scientific background to recognize sapphires as consisting of aluminum oxide, corundum, whereas sand is most commonly composed of silicon dioxide, quartz. Both are crystalline materials, their makeup's differentiated by one element. So to say that we are sapphires laying on sand, the perspective character of the song is perhaps saying, because of one internal difference, you and I do not fit into the rest of the world. Ooh. I wasn't with there. Okay, we'll continue. But that's good. Anyway, the perspective character goes on to say, the world now tastes a bit saltier. Is that because they're crying, tears being salty, or because the pressures of the world cause them to collapse from aluminum oxide to sodium chloride, salt? This might be me reading too far into it. There's no physical mechanism for sapphire to become salt, as far as I know. But in the context of the series this song is associated with, a sense of incongruity is fitting, and salt is a common component of coastline sand for obvious reasons. In the same verse, the perspective character of the song, who again may or may not be the eponymous executioner, relates her past to a red line. A common concept in East Asian belief is the red string of fate. So to evoke the image of a red line, string, the perspective character is lamenting that her future may be preordained. This idea is corroborated by the next line in the song, is the future set in place? Therefore, I'm compelled to think that the whole verse is meant to be taken together. There is an implication that the perspective character is not a good girl, and she wishes to be one. My question is, does becoming a good girl mean that the sapphire must become sand? I wanted to get another opinion on this lyrical analysis because I haven't found anyone else making these connections. I had a very emotional reaction to the song when I gave it a proper listen. Now it says pause for discussion, so we'll do that, and then there's a little bit more afterward. Cool. As I was saying, interrupting the middle of it a little bit. No, I think that's a compelling reading. At the very beginning, I thought, no, you're reading too much into it. But no, I think that's pretty compelling. So a big point that that PistilWhip, excuse me, is making here is that because of the context of the series as a whole, which was likely known when this was written, it seems more reasonable basically to make a larger jump than maybe it would normally be. Like PistilWhip here is aware that it might seem like a bit of a leap, but because I've watched the first like 3 episodes of the show, because the show is literally about exactly that, it seems like a crazy coincidence if the song just happens to also evoke that same thing, you know? This is a case where, as with much interpretation, we need to be careful of our human tendency to recognize patterns, but I think a really good way to do that is to look for a large amount of correlation rather than just a little bit. Don't so lightly say like, oh, one random interpretation that could be a thing is this because I know these things. But if there's another component connected to the piece of work or whatever that seems to fit, then I think it becomes rapidly more likely. It then goes from like, but why would that be what it means, to why wouldn't that be what it means? How could the person who wrote this not know that? Like, rather obvious in the context of the whole series, connection between the two things. Um, Again, I don't think the sapphire and sand thing is obvious, by the way. I was like, that, wow, that's a thing. I don't think that's obvious. But the idea that, the sapphire is laying on sand, I think people generally, like, sand is a rock, sort of, um, and then the idea that it's salty, or probably both because of tears, because this is a sad thing, and also because the ocean, they're just evoking the sand on the beach metaphor. That that just makes sense in the context of the series, like being about that. Again, I don't want to spoil this show that much, but I will say that the sort of crux of the show, the first few episodes I watched, is that there is a lost one, like a person from Japan who came to this other world, that basically the executioner more or less doesn't want to kill. That's a very brief summary intended to avoid as many spoilers as possible. Um, and in the context of the show that this song is the opening for being about that, it would be pretty weird if that was a complete coincidence, right? So I think this is a great example of I haven't gotten to do a lot of literary interpretation since college, where I was an English major and found it really frustrating how people didn't really have any way to draw a line between something that is just literally any interpretation of a thing and something that feels more meaningful. It can be challenging to avoid looking at, well, what did the author mean, and instead look at it as what meaning appears from this body of work. But I do also think it's productive to look at, what meanings function, to demonstrate where there are literally just connections. There being connections to other things in a franchise is a really helpful way to think of it. I think that making music for a game or a show that it's connected to like another piece of art, you could say, that makes it a lot easier because you can draw connections like that. Another thing I'm having difficulty avoiding, though, to move on to another point, is that as much as I find that initial reading compelling, I can't help but think, having played Limbus Company quite a bit actually since that parlay, I'm enjoying it. Although I did say that I thought the story wasn't that cringeworthy, and I have changed my mind about that. But I do think it's a cool game, and there is more music, I believe, by this artist in that game. And I have to say, the lyrics are often doing that free association thing pretty willy-nilly, right? There's a lot of things that, if you play the whole game, maybe they make a lot of sense, or you get why this is being sung. But I do think that some elements of the metaphor may just be things that sound cool as well. For example, why sapphires? It says, "We are sapphires laying on sand." Having watched a little bit of the show, there is no obvious reason to me why sapphires. Like, why not some other rock? One obvious reason why sapphires is that we are sapphires laying on sand. Sounds good. A gem that sounds good in this part of the lyric, right? Um, Again, I think a big thing I've experienced in literary interpretation is that people will often have like one modus operandi for how they interpret things, and they always do that every single time. I'm not talking about you, PistilWhip, by the way. I'm just saying, I think here it's important not to get carried away and, kind of like you do, not look too hard for a meaning for every single word. Like, looking at the trend is okay. Sapphires are a perfectly serviceable metaphor. Could it be that sapphires have a little bit of a connotation as being a feminine gem? Is that reaching? I don't know. But besides that, I think sapphire sounds enough like, we're referring to the two female leads. That's it's good enough, right? So so yeah, I do think the thing about the sapphires like becoming sand is might be a bit of a stretch, sure, but thematically, it seems like that's what the lyric is saying. Um, Rocks on rocks, even though some of them are different. Um, I think the biggest point of tension for a lot of people will be Yatagami's bit where you said, I'll read it again. Um, both are crystalline materials, both are rocks. Their makeup's differentiated by one element. So to say that we are sapphires laying on sand, the perspective character of the song is perhaps saying, Because of one internal difference, you and I do not fit into the rest of the world. That's the one that to me is like right on the edge. It's like that does seem like a little bit of a stretch that the lyricist like was thinking about the chemical composition of sapphires, but mm, well, and then why sapphire? Because it is similar to that element. So that's another thing. Again, I don't think any of those things on their own makes it that reasonable to say, oh, that's what it all means. But when you build up this cloud of things, don't you agree, listener, that it seems a little weird if that isn't why? Like there's a reason right here, right here that explains why you would do all that stuff together. So like isn't that what it is? Like doesn't it just make more sense at that point to assume that? Another thing I think is useful in these contexts is to use the old Occam's razor. Is there a more simple explanation for why these things are that way? And I can't really think of one, no. Um, Another quick note, I think that the sapphires could be viewed as doing double duty with there's a line about faster than the speed of light, shining bright, falling into our eyes. The sapphires are like shooting stars, sort of. That makes sense, but that could be any gem, and so it feels like the reason for sapphire might be the chemical composition, sure. For what it's worth, and you don't want to go too far with this, but a type of author interpretation that I personally think is kind of useful is, does Cassie Way know the composition of sapphire and sand? I I want to say yes. Listening to other things that this artist has written, yeah, I think there's a decent chance. Is my point. This kind of seems like the kind of person who would do something like that. I don't know, but for what it's worth, if you the part of the parlay, and it's not going to be the whole parlay, where I basically just reassure you that that is a sane interpretation and talk a little bit about literary interpretation. I would say, yeah, that like I think that makes perfect sense. By the way, I don't think there's too much to say here, but the thing about my path traces out a red line, is the future set in place, blah blah, blah, that whole thing. Totally the red string of fate. That's such an enormously popular symbol. It would just be insane if that wasn't what was meant by that. Like that is such an overwhelmingly common piece of visual imagery. It would just be weird if that wasn't what it is. I do also think that red here is meant to evoke blood because the executioner has been killing people. Looking back, my path traces out a red line of blood because I've been killing people this whole time. Is the future set in place is then meant to read between the lines. Am I just going to keep killing people, including the other sapphire beside me, the other female lead? Um, Now, a big pivotal point before we move on. You said, does becoming a good girl mean that the sapphire must become sand? Um, no, I think my reading so far is that forward marching forward, looking back, my path traces out a red line, killing people. Is the future set in place? Do I need to keep killing people? Is it not too late? Too late to be a good girl today, meaning to not kill the other female lead. That's what I think so far. I don't know any of the lyrics of the rest of the song, nor have I watched like any more of the show. But to me, it feels like uh, that that is evoking not committing murder. Um, the the sapphires, I guess, are people who don't belong, and the sand is the world they live in. So I would argue that like becoming sand would mean conforming. That would mean continuing to kill people because that's her job. So in my mind, the being a good girl thing means not killing anymore, not conforming, basically. So what it's too late, what she hopes it isn't too late for is to stop conforming, I think. Um, but that's just my interpretation. Again, without more lyrics, it's hard to say. Although we are getting more lyrics, and so I'm going to move on a little earlier than I'd planned, just so we have a bit more of the text. Though do keep in mind this isn't like the entire song. or the whole show. Yatagami continues, for what it's worth, the answer to the question of must the sapphire become sand seems to be no, as far as Paper Bouquet's final chorus is concerned. Again, there's some emphasis. Emphasis. It all matters. Every drop of tear. Every drop of tear. Every cowardly dream. End emphasis. So we ripped out pages of the scriptures, folded a billion paper flowers, and painted them every color. Every piece we made is my treasure. Emphasis. We walked down the aisle unexplored. We walked down the aisle unexplored. End emphasis. Remaining strangers. Yatagami continues, I choose to interpret this as we can celebrate our differences and find a path the world has not set for us. Thus, the last line of the chorus, remaining strangers, refers not to the estrangement of the prospective character and their companion, but to the rest of the world. The sand may not recognize sapphires, but we sapphires will find our own way together. Indeed, I think that with this part of the song, I was being a bit coy earlier. With this part of the song here, I think it makes much more sense to interpret it the way I interpreted it. I think you can see how some of the metaphors match up now. So, for example, it says, we ripped out pages of the scriptures, also connected to the sand. This is the society she lives in. Her job as an executioner. We're destroying that and turning it into something else. A billion paper flowers, and then we're painting them every color. Feels to me connected to the red line from before. So we're changing that. It's not just red anymore. There's now color. There's also that common metaphor of people who have become kind of numb to this bad situation they're in, then having color return to their life, which I feel it comes up here. But yeah, the fact that we used the color before to say it's just red is the bad path, and now we have full of color, this is a better way of approaching it. And the way that was achieved was by destroying scripture. Makes it clear to me that avoiding the red path and not committing murder is the good girl thing. It's not conforming. Although that's a little weird because the term good girl in English to me says conforming, but that's odd. And for what it's worth, this artist uses a lot of different languages. So I don't feel, I actually don't remember off the top of my head, but this song is also likely translated, right? It's in Japanese, and so that line is a translation. Let me just extremely quickly refresh my memory. Oh, nope, just kidding. No, it's in English. But anyway, if this is not a bit of a stretch for Cassie Wei, she is a Chinese Canadian vocalist and lyricist in a Japanese group who has worked extensively with Project Moon, the Korean developers behind Library of Ruina and Limbus Company. I don't think it's a stretch to suggest that the perspective of that word may be a lot of things. Not necessarily that Cassie Wei doesn't know that good girl evokes like conforming, but that she might also know the context that has in 4 other languages. And so it's possible that meaning of good girl conforming doesn't fit. Again, I think as a means of literary interpretation, it's useful to think, what would break the metaphors more? What would break the allegory more? Good girl meaning conforming or not? And it seems like more details fit if that doesn't mean conforming to me. But I definitely see why there's a question, by the way. I don't think that it's weird to be confused by that. I'm a little thrown off by that, sure. Anyway, another bit I think is key is the every drop of tear, every cowardly dream. If we go with PistilWhip's interpretation that the world now tastes a bit saltier, means like, yeah, laying on sand because we're by the ocean, but the saltiness is because of tears, like crying. Then it all matters. Every drop of tear, every cowardly dream feels like it's saying like it's okay to, you know, have struggled through that, right? That feels like validating that point. And following it immediately with ripping out pages of the scriptures feels like, yeah, okay, we're clearly not conforming. That was it was okay to have shed tears over that because we struggled through it, that kind of thing. The The final line I think is a hard bit for interpretation. Remaining strangers, PistilWhip's interpretation to remind you, is thus the last line of the chorus. Remaining strangers refers not to the estrangement of the prospective character and their companion, but to the rest of the world. The sand may not recognize sapphires, but we sapphires will find our own way together. Yeah, I find that compelling. I think that this is a great example of how that would seem like a stretch if it weren't for the rest of the context, right? But in the face of everything that's been said here, it doesn't feel sensible to interpret that another way. Again, we've already set up. We walked down the aisle unexplored twice, and we are sapphires laying on sand. They're already strangers in a way that was set up previously, so it doesn't feel weird to interpret it that way, even though in normal colloquial English that would be an odd thing to say at this juncture. Um, I do also think there's a trope of people as they're, you know, getting an understanding with each other, being willing to understand that they don't understand and moving forward from there. Um, there, I also think there's a kind of more subtle line here that remaining strangers means not killing the other female lead. That's possible. Um, we're going to remain strangers because you're going to remain alive. So I wonder if that's a bit. I'm not sure I have too much else to say about this part. Just some thoughts about literary interpretation. I think that one of the useful things about interpreting a text like this, it can just be fun, kind of like a puzzle or a scavenger hunt, to look through and think of details certain ways. And I liked this one because I didn't feel it evoked too many things that are not, pretty readily easy to imagine. I almost feel like you could kind of understand this without the context of the anime, which is I think that's good. For what it's worth, it's not full of what I would think of as contingent difficulty in the sense that it's not referencing a bunch of stuff. There might be the bit about understanding the chemical composition of sapphires, but I don't think you need that necessarily to interpret the rest. It just maybe makes it easier to come to the conclusion that, yeah, like it seems like we're saying it's okay not to conform. And I don't know, I just think it can be a useful way to think of, you can become aware of your own biases very quickly. That's something. But understanding that another person made the work this way can just be satisfying. It can be cool to see how a story or kind of a breadcrumb trail was put together in lyrics that sound good. If you think that subjectively sound good. Um, I actually don't know if I particularly like this song as music one way or another. A lot of the melee stuff that I've heard, I don't know if I like the the musicality of it, but the atmosphere has always for me worked very well. There's a bit in Limbus Company that I won't talk about too much because it's kind of a huge spoiler, where you fight a boss after having gained quite a lot of context on that boss and one of your characters who you should, by the way, like have a heart, like let him kill the boss. You gotta have him in the team. Um, you have a lot of context on them, and a song by this artist plays. At least I'm almost certain it's by this artist. Plays while you fight the boss, and lyrics appear on the battlefield with you. Limbus Company battlefield can get pretty chaotic, and so you're beating the hell out of this person while and hearing the brutal like blood squirting sounds of this game while this like gentle choir music is playing. And then there's a bit of a change, and I can't talk about it more because of spoilers, but it's an interesting moment. And for me, the focusing on the lyrics of the music too much, kind of like focusing on lyrics of music too much ever, in my opinion, mutes some of the point. It's often used for atmosphere. And again, I think here it's very effective atmosphere in that fight. But the exact specifics of the lyrics you could view as being a little on the nose. They would seem like nonsense if you didn't have the context. And now that you do, there's, maybe no need to hide the thread too much. Um, but yeah, I just think that's interesting. I think it's a good note about interpreting music. Sometimes I think when you read music like I did, I tried very hard to have no readerly voice, not to read it like poetry. I am of the opinion that that is not helpful. You can very easily make people who don't think about poetry or literature at all, impressed by reading in like a "it all matters." Every drop of tear, every cowardly, like with emotion or whatever. But personally, I think that's incredibly fake sounding and not actually effective for delivering the piece of work. It is far better to read with no slant as much as possible than with that slant, in my opinion. I had a pretty traumatic theater class, I think I've talked about before, where our theater teacher basically like forced us to not read with like a voice, which I found I thought that was really irresponsible of her. Like that class is bad and should be stopped. And I actually complained about it a little bit in the summary, but it's complicated. And I talked to her about it too because that was very valuable. I just don't think you should be able to just like sign up and basically experience mental trauma. Like that's not safe. I had already tackled this subject quite a bit, so it was fine for me. But every single person in that entire class broke down into tears in front of their peers many times, and maybe that should be like normalized or whatever. That's okay. Crying is fine. But you see what I'm trying to say? Like you shouldn't be going through emotional trauma for credit. That's not cool. Like that's not good. If it said, you're gonna cry your eyes out in this class, like I'm gonna make you cry and learn to read poetry good, nobody would take the class. I mean, okay, I actually might have taken that. I'd be like, no, I won't, and then be proven wrong. But anyway, my point was just that awkward anecdote aside, is that it can be difficult to interpret lyrics when reading them as prose or poetry because they're not. At least I think usually they're not. The way that the metaphors might hit is different. They're often delivered in song, and the piece is meant to work without you sitting down and reading the lyrics in most cases. And so, looser use of metaphor is important. And I would argue the marginal benefit of making some words just sound good, even if they don't perfectly fit your allegory, is higher in music. Like the balance is swayed a little further in favor of it sounding good, even if it doesn't make absolute complete sense. And often the song itself will create an interpretation, right? Like hearing the way the chords in the music will help you understand maybe the mood that is trying to be communicated. And we don't have that when we experience it this way, which I don't think is a problem at all. By the way, I linked the song in the description if you want. It just means that it's important to keep that in mind. We are interpreting a song, not just these words in this combination. It being the song of an anime series, too, I think that's important context, even if you don't know what the show is. We've done some interesting parlay about anime intros before. Anyhow, yeah, this was really cool. Yatagami PistilWhip, I keep doing that, has a few. You have both names on your thing, but we've talked about this PistilWhip. Um, As a few parting thoughts that I thought I would mention. We already mentioned Cassie Wei, a Chinese Canadian Chinese vocalist and lyricist in a Japanese group who has worked extensively with Project Moon, the Korean developers behind Library of Ruin and Limbus Company. The full version of Paper Blossom, Paper Bouquet, the song is in the description, and yeah, Pistol Whip. I keep doing that. Almost also wanted to invite us to read the Executioner and Her Way of Life's Wikipedia page. You all can find that on your own. But for what it's worth, I thought like it was a decent amount of fun. I might go back to it. What I watched wasn't amazing in my opinion, but neither was I bored. It clearly the broad strokes left an imprint on my mind. Um, I do think it falls into a category of anime that has been pretty successful recently. There's been a lot of these recently, which I would describe as like girls meet cute. Two girls who are like oil and water, meet each other, and you know it's very cute. I don't know how I don't know how much more subtext you want me to put in here. Um, uh, there could be an interesting discussion here about whether that is queer baity, but I personally think that looking at a show like why am I not remembering Licorice Recoil? If you're familiar with that show, it feels in a similar vein to me. Where at least in Licorice Recoil, I think I don't think that's queer baiting in my opinion. Like no, they're totally into each other. the show is not beating around the bush too much about that, in my opinion. Characters don't have to like sleep with each other to, you know, be serious about each other. I think the show commits to them being, you know, like gal pals. I think that's fine. And I haven't watched more of this show, but that was I thought, or is this another show in that mold a little bit? Anyway, just if you want to watch that show, that is a piece of context I thought like that might be kind of interesting, and I thought it was, you know, it was cool. So yeah, thanks for the parlay. If you want to get a parlay like this, you can check out how to do that in the description. PistilWhip, thank you for this one, and sorry for reading both of your names like 5 times.